Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have now reached the final lecture of this course, and we have a full agenda ahead of us tonight if we are to conclude all of the points still uncovered. So let me at the outset tell you the agenda I propose to follow this evening. First, there is one last new theoretical topic, the topic of analogies to cover. That will be brief, and it will represent the final theory in this course. Then, without a break, I'll go straight to the homework that we have accumulated from the last few weeks, Mill's methods, those examples, and I think we have 4 definitions still left. I will then take a 16-minute break. That are actually in the booklet, which I can't obviously assign for next week because there is no next week. And since there's 8 of them, 16 minutes gives you precisely 2 minutes apiece. After the break, I will take about 5 minutes to answer several questions that I have been receiving steadily and ignoring equally steadily throughout the course regarding my book and its progress and about future courses that I or others may be offering. And then we'll take up the analogies that you will have worked in that 16 minutes. And finally, we will have questions. A number of interesting ones have accumulated from past weeks, and I want to say something at least on some of them, and any new questions from tonight, time permitting. All right, that's the agenda, and let's plunge in with the theory of analogies. First of all, what is an analogy? An analogy is a comparison. In the simplest terms, you draw an analogy between two things whenever you say that one of them is like another in some respects. So if you want a formal definition, I would say to draw an analogy between two or more things is to indicate one or more respects in which they are similar. To draw an analogy between two or more things is to indicate one or more respects in which they are similar. And so this is something you do all the time. An aged man, you might say, is like an experienced traveler on the road of life. You're drawing an analogy there between the two, and obviously you're implying at least one obvious respect in which they are similar. They've both spent a substantial amount of time following some course of action. Or, he behaved at the party like a bull in a china shop. There's an analogy between him at the party and a bull in a china shop. And obviously the implied similarity is that they're both obstreperous, clumsy, destructive, etc. Now there are 3 main functions or usages which analogies have. Only one actually concerns us in connection with a logic course. But I'll mention the other 2 first, simply to set them aside because they do not involve argumentative uses of analogy. So let's look at those 2 briefly just to get rid of them. The first you can describe as the literary use of analogies. And this takes place in either fiction or non-fiction for the purpose of providing colorful, imaginative descriptions, creating vivid, memorable pictures or images. And of course, depending upon the particular type of analogy or comparison that's drawn in literature, you call it a metaphor or a simile or personification, etc. Well, those distinctions don't concern us here. So, for instance, if I can quote you a line from Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Now there is a use of analogy for vivid pictorial literary purposes. He's comparing life to a field of thorns and his suffering to, in effect, to the ripped flesh that he feels when he falls upon the thorn. You may or may not like the content of that, but you get the idea that an analogy can be effective literarily. We quoted one from Tennyson in connection with definitions, I think, into the jaws of death rode the valiant 400, where you're comparing death to an animal and likening it to a creature which devours man. That is a literary use of analogy. Now, second, there is what we can call the explanatory or pedagogical use of analogy. In this use, you use analogies simply to illustrate, to clarify some new view or theory which you were putting forth, and you clarify it by comparing it to something already understood. You give an analogy to something the audience or the listener, the reader already grasps, simply thereby to make your own theory clear. So, for instance, Plato put forth a new theory of the soul, of the human personality, in which he said there were three elements. The rational element, the part that did the thinking, the violent, passional element that felt the intense emotions, and then what he regarded as a third and lowest part of the soul, what he called the appetites, the desires for physical things. And since this was a new theory that he put forth, he gave an analogy to clarify it. He said, imagine that each human being has inside of his skin three separate creatures. A little man, and that's the analog, you see, the counterpart of the rational element. A raging lion, and that's the counterpart of the passionate element, and a many-headed, slobbering, drooling beast, and that is the counterpart of the third element, the appetite. Now, of course, he didn't believe that you have these three creatures. This was simply a very clarifying analogy for him to present his views. And this is very common even to this day among scientists of all kinds. Here, for instance, is the use of analogy simply for explanatory purposes by an English physicist trying to explain the differences between a solid, liquid, and a gas by picturing the different motions of the molecules in each. And of course, he doesn't think what he's about to say literally happens, but it's simply an analogy. And he writes, quote, in a solid, the molecules can be pictured as a crowd of men all doing physical exercises, their daily dozen, so to speak, without moving from the spot where they stand. In a liquid, the molecules can be pictured as a swarm of men gathered together in a hall at a crowded reception. They are tightly wedged, but each one works his way through the others with many a push and apology. For a gas, we have to think of a large open space on which men are walking without looking where they are going. Each man continues in a straight line until he bumps into someone else, when he abruptly starts off again in a different direction. Unquote. Now that is a sweet little analogy. Very clear and clarifying. Now you see, again, he's not trying to prove anything, merely illustrate a new theory, new to his audience at least, by a familiar comparison. But we are concerned now with number 3. Analogies used as arguments. Analogies which purport to prove something. And those, of course, are called analogical arguments. Analogical arguments, or arguments from analogy. And before I give you a formal definition, let me give you a very simple example. You read one book, let us say, by Agatha Christie, and it is a mystery, a whodunit, and it's from her early period, say it came out originally in the 30s. And it's a full novel, not a collection of short stories. And you found you enjoyed it very much. Now you come across a second book. It's also by Agatha Christie. And it's also a mystery, a whodunit. And it's also from the 30s. And it's also a full novel, not a short story. And you say to yourself, well, I guess I will enjoy this one also. That is a very, very simple analogy. The two things you're comparing in this case are the two books. And the essence of your reasoning is this. You're saying these two books are alike in a number of respects which I know. They're alike, for instance, in being by Agatha Christie, in being whodunits, in being from her early period, in being full novels. So they have various known similarities. In the example I gave you, they are alike in 4 respects. And so you reason, I infer they will be alike in one further respect. The first has the additional characteristic of my enjoying it. I infer that characteristic will be applicable to the next one. I infer I will enjoy the second also. That's a simple analogical argument. Now let me dictate to you a mouth-breaking formal definition, but if you keep this Agatha Christie example in mind, it isn't too often. I'll dictate it first with punctuation, etc. An analogical argument is an argument which infers, comma, from the similarity of two or more things, comma, situations or relationships. In one or more respects, comma, a similarity among them in some further respect. An analogical argument is an argument which infers from the similarity of two or more things, situations, or relationships in one or more respects, a similarity among them in some further respect. So there's three elements to an analogy. They're the things you're comparing. You can have two, or three, or four, or as many as you want, but the minimum, of course, is two. They may be things, they may be situations. You can even compare two relationships, as some of the examples on the exercise booklet do. You can compare the relation of a father to his child with the relation of a teacher to her pupil. That would be an analogy between two relationships. So you start with two or more things, situations, or relationships. You know that they are similar in one or more respects. Maybe one is the minimum. The example I gave you was 4 respects. And then you infer a similarity in some further respect. So, if you look at an analogy from the point of view of premises and conclusions, the premises are the known similarities. These two, or however many things, are alike in respect such and such, such and such, such and such. The conclusion is the inferred similarity. Therefore, I infer they will be alike in this respect. If you wanted to symbolize an analogy, you'd have to make 3 columns. Similar to, but with different names than the 3 columns we had when we were symbolizing mill. I didn't bother to put this on the booklet. I don't know how much it adds, but your first column would be labeled case, and then you would write underneath it 1, 2, or however many there were. And then your next column would be labeled known similarities. That's the thing that's not in debate, where you know these cases are alike. And you'd give letters to the various similarities. Suppose, for instance, we arbitrarily say they had 3 similarities. And we call them A, B, and C. Then beside case 1, under known similarities, you'd write A, B, C, and the same for 2, and the same for 3, however many cases. And then your third column would be labeled inferred similarity. And under it, you would put whatever is the characteristic, in this case, let's call it D, that you know obtains in the first cases, but you're reasoning to prove that it obtains in the case in question. That is the way you would symbolize the structure of an analogy. Now I'll give you an actual analogy. This is a poor analogy. We'll get to when they're good or bad in a moment, but simply so you can hear a real-life analogy. This is an example taken from Thomas Reid, who was an 18th century Scottish philosopher. And it's invariably used in logic texts because it's a good example of an analogy, and it's a very poor one on top of it. Quote, "We may observe a very great similitude," that means similarity, "between this earth which we inhabit and the other planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury. They all revolve around the sun as the earth does, although at different distances and in different periods. They borrow all their light from the sun as the earth does. Several of them are known to revolve around their axes like the earth, and by that means must have a like succession of day and night. Some of them have moons that serve to give light in the absence of the sun, as our moon does to us. They are all in their motion subject to the same law of gravitation as the earth is. From all this similitude, it is not unreasonable to think that these planets may, like our earth, be the habitation of living creatures. There is some probability in this conclusion from analogy," unquote. Now, of course, there isn't, for a reason that we'll mention subsequently, but that illustrates the structure. In this case, you had an analogy between a number of cases. I think they knew 5 planets at that time other than the Earth, so there's 6 cases. And he mentioned, 3 or 4 or 5 known similarities, and then the inferred similarity was, well, we know in the case of the Earth there's life, therefore we infer in the case of all the others there's life. So life would be the similarity he is inferring. Now, before we indicate what's wrong with that, let us focus for a moment on the nature of analogical reasoning. Is this a new form of argument? To which by new I mean something other than deduction, which we spent several weeks on, or induction, essentially generalization, which we looked at last week. Now, the answer of the Aristotelian tradition to that question, with which objectivism agrees, is that an analogy is not a new or distinct form of reasoning. It is simply a combination in condensed form of two different processes of reasoning. And you can see this simply enough if you simply write down the following as a simplified structure of an analogy. Let us suppose we're comparing only two cases, 1 and 2. I give you this just symbolic. And we know that they both have A, B, and C in common. The first one also has D, and we're concluding that therefore the second one has D. Well, what are my premises in that case? My premises are essentially twofold. Case 1, A, B, and C goes along with D. Case 2 has A, B, and C. Conclusion, case 2 has D. Now the question is, what in the world would validate this type of reasoning? How can you go from saying, in case 1, A, B, and C goes together with D, therefore it will in case 2? The analogical argument as such gives you no basis for that reasoning. There's only one grounds on which it would be justified, and that is if in fact there were a connection between A, B, C, and D. If there was some causal or necessary relation between A, B, C, and D, then you would be allowed to generalize from case 1. And so, having seen that A, B, and C necessarily go together with D, you could say, whatever has A, B, and C must have D. That generalization is valid. And of course, once that generalization is valid, it's routine deduction then to apply it to case 2 and say, well, case 2 has A, B, and C, therefore case 2 must have D. So if we give this now using the Agatha Christie example. Case 1, Agatha Christie mystery from her early period, let's restrict to that, is something I enjoy. Now you can't say anything about case 2 without the implicit generalization, Any mystery by Agatha Christie in her early period I will enjoy. That's the implicit generalization. And then from there, the rest of the reasoning is straightforward deduction. This is a mystery by Agatha Christie from her early period, therefore, by applying the generalization to it, I will enjoy. In other words, analogical reasoning is simply a combination of generalization and deduction. It's the implicit generalization from the known cases that justifies you in applying the generalization to the unknown case. This is not, therefore, a new method of argument. And notice, the generalization is never explicit in an analogical argument, or very rarely. It's simply left hovering in the air to mediate the transition from the first case to the second. But what I stress here is that this is not a new method of argument. It's simply a two-step process. You implicitly generalize, and then you immediately deduce. Since this is not a new method of argument, there is no such thing as a distinctive proof by analogy. There's no such thing as a distinctive analogical proof. All there is can you prove your generalization, and is your deduction using it valid? It's a shorthand way of combining generalization and deduction in one step. Now, to evaluate analogies, to determine whether they are any good or not, the essential thing that you must do is evaluate the generalization that is implicit in the analogy. The deductive element in the case of analogies is rarely, if ever, invalid. I have never seen anybody perform the deductive side wrong because it's too simple. The generalization is so bald, and the syllogism involved is Barbara, and therefore almost nobody ever goes wrong on that. So the real issue in evaluating analogies is, what is the general principle, the generalization that is implicitly being asserted, and is it true? If it is, then of course the analogy is fine, but then of course you didn't really need the analogy. You could just give the generalization and go about your business. The problem is that in most cases, it's hard to say how many, but in my experience, I would be taking a wild guess if I said 90%, but something like that. 90% of analogies are usually no good, because the inherent flaw of analogical reasoning is you base your generalization on so few cases, usually just on one case, you see, and then you jump right away to an implicit generalization. And in fact, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that people employ analogies in arguments is because they want to sneak in a generalization that they couldn't possibly justify if they stated it explicitly. So they simply give one example and then leap right away to another example, counting upon the implicit acceptance of the generalization. And the way, of course, to defuse that kind of analogy is to identify what is the generalization he is implicitly relying upon. And in a great many cases, the thing collapses of its own weight as soon as you name it. Now, of course, to check a generalization, you employ all of the techniques that we mentioned last time. What quantity of instances if you're using simple enumeration? What variety? Are there any negative instances? How does it come out on the count of integrating it with other knowledge? Is it strengthened or weakened when you connect it with other knowledge? Are you trying to establish a causal connection by experimental methods? If so, are you using agreement or difference, concomitant variations, residues, etc.? In other words, you bring to bear whatever you know about how to validate or test a generalization on the generalization that is implicitly being asserted. Now, in particular, there are two things that you'll find very helpful in evaluating analogies, and specifically in evaluating the generalizations that are implicit in them. The first good test to use is this. Are the known similarities relevant to the characteristic you're trying to establish? Are the known similarities relevant to the characteristic you're trying to establish? Now let me give you different cases here. To begin with, suppose we start with two peaches. You come to the first peach and you look at it. And it has a certain, an orangish peach color, I guess. And it has a certain texture and feel. And it was picked at a certain season in a certain climate and so on. Those are the given characteristics. And you taste the peach and it has a luscious, sweet taste. Now you come to a second peach. And it has the same color and texture and feel and came from the same climate and season and so on. And you infer this one is going to taste luscious and sweet also. Now, there is a simple analogy, and here, obviously, the known similarities are relevant. If the peach is green or as hard as a rock, for instance, that's obviously going to be relevant to what it tastes like. And here, therefore, your generalization has some plausibility. If you say all peaches with a certain color, texture, from a certain climate, etc., will have a certain taste, there is a certain strength to that. On the other hand, take this analogy. You're a doctor. You come to your first patient and his name is Brown. You look at his tie and it's green stripes, and you find that he likes Gunsmoke, the TV show. And then you diagnose him and you find that he has typhoid. So they say, fine, you get to your next patient and his name is Brown. He has a tie with green stripes and he likes Gunsmoke, so you say, well, by analogy, he must have typhoid also. Now that, of course, is a hopeless analogy, because the implicit generalization is that everybody who's named Brown has a green tie and likes Gunsmoke has typhoid, which is hopelessly false. Your characteristics there, the known similarities, are simply irrelevant to the one you're trying to establish. It simply is coincidental. And if you remember, we said that one of the big problems in generalizing is to avoid coincidences. Well, here is the application to that in connection with analogies. The known characteristics must be relevant to the characteristic that you're trying to establish. Otherwise, of course, the whole thing collapses. And then a second, and in a certain way, even more important point in evaluating analogies. Are there any crucial conditions necessary for the truth of the generalization which hold in one case and not in the other? Are there any crucial conditions necessary for the truth of the generalization which hold in one case and not in the other? Now this is the point that corresponds to the issue of omitting necessary conditions. There may be significant differences between the cases. So even though the characteristics cited are not completely irrelevant, there is a huge difference which wipes out the analogy. Now, of course, the Thomas Reid example that I gave you is a perfect example of this. There is all those similarities between the Earth and the other planets, but there are at least two crucial differences that are necessary for the phenomenon of life that, so far as we know, do not obtain in the other planets. One is the atmospheric condition and the other is temperature. And therefore, on the grounds of those differences alone, the analogy is invalidated. Now, if there is a significant difference, one that annihilates the analogy, that difference is referred to as take a guess, just a negative prefix to the word analogy. It's called a disanalogy, D-I-S, a disanalogy. And if there is any disanalogy, a significant one, of course, every two things will differ in some respect, but if there is a significant disanalogy, that means that there is a condition which the general principle requires, which is absent in the new case, and therefore the analogy does not hold. Now, let me give you briefly an example of an actual analogy, which is a simple one, and you can see how you'd apply this theory. This is one I took from a textbook. The social and political institutions of the B-E-E, are characterized by a remarkable degree of selflessness in subordinating the individual to the high. Now you can guess already what's coming. Each B seems to know his place and to fulfill it to the best of his ability, and in so doing he appears content. It is possible that the success and permanence of these arrangements can teach us lessons of great value in our own political thinking on the human level. For example, our government might be much more stable if we took greater pains to discover everyone's abilities and needs and give him the right job, a proposition I recommend to the social scientists for further serious study. Now there is, you see, a straightforward, poor analogy. And you see it's drawn between bees and men. So if you're analyzing this, you'd put case 1 bees, case 2 men. Now he doesn't tell us what is the same, and this is a common fact in analogies. They simply don't tell you what characteristics do you know are the same. They leave it to implication and you have to scrounge around. What could he mean? We know uncontroversially it's the same, which is our premise. And here, as far as I can see, there's two main points. They're both living creatures. That's uncontroversial. And they both, in some sense, engage in social or cooperative activity, as against, complete loner-type species. So let's say those are the known similarities. What is the additional characteristic that is true of bees, he claims? Well, that their selfless subordination to the collective leads to contentment and success. And therefore, he concludes that same mouthful characteristic will apply to human beings. What's the implicit generalization? Now, it becomes a huge mouthful to state, but it's something like this. All living creatures whose members are in some sense social or cooperative are such that if they all selflessly subordinate themselves to the collective, the result will be contentment and success. Now, you could then proceed to attack that generalization on all kinds of counts. Here, the obvious count would be that there is a fundamental disanalogy, a fundamental difference between men and bees, namely that men have reason, they live by the exercise of their mind, and then you would proceed by the method of objectivism, if you agree with that reasoning, that requires intellectual independence, and that therefore requires individualism as against collectivism, and that collectivism might work for bees precisely because they're mindless. That would be just a brief sketch of how you go about pointing out a disanalogy. All right, let us conclude and summarize this by letting me dictate for you the steps in order you should follow to work analogies. First, find the things being compared. Sometimes those will be entities, sometimes situations, sometimes species, sometimes relationships, but first find them. That'll be what you put under your case column. Second, enumerate the known similarities. Now, these may be explicitly told you, or they may be simply left to implication, as in the B case. So you simply have to take a guess. What does he think we know is similar? But this can't be controversial. This is our premise. Therefore, if the analogy is to stand, the known similarities must be truly known similarities. Third, state the inferred similarity. In other words, the one you're trying to prove, or that the analogy is trying to prove. Now you have the general structure, and you're prepared for state the general principle that is implicit. And the general principle will always have the structure. All possessors of the known similarities will be possessors of the inferred similarity. Which is sometimes a huge mouthful to say, though, if it's a long analogy. And then finally, evaluate the analogy. Are the known similarities relevant? Are there any disanalogies, significant ones, etc.? And then you end up by saying, this is good or this is bad. That's it. Now, there are 8 in the booklet, which I'll ask you to do during the break. And now let us go right to the homework that we had on Mill's methods on page 9. Now, if you have the booklet out, open to page 9. Let us look at number 1. And this is given, as you see, in simply symbolic form. So in connection with number 1, there's no issue of are the relevant factors, does it include all the relevant factors? There's no issue of proper analysis. It's simply an exercise on understanding the method. So we assume that he's got the proper factors. And he's got 3 cases. And he lists off the various antecedent factors which are present. And in the first case, E, the effect occurred. In the second, it didn't. The third, it did. And then in part A, it says the scientist infers from the above that neither A nor B is the cause of E. Which of Mill's methods is he using? Well, let's look at the A. Now, is there a way? There are several different ways, 2 different ways in which you could show from this information that A, small a here, is not the cause of the effect. How can you tell it just looking at the information given in case 2? How can you tell that A is not the cause of the effect simply from looking at case 2? I'll take a volunteer if anyone has an idea on that. At the back.
The effect occurred when A was there and did not occur.
Yes, you're right. In case 2, the effect did not occur when A was present. And we know that there is a principle of elimination which says nothing can be the cause in the presence of which the effect does not occur. That is the principle of elimination used by which method? Difference. Right, you just have to keep those straight. But this one is difference, and therefore you could eliminate A by difference on case 2. Now, of course, that by itself would not tell you that A isn't a necessary condition. For all you know from case 2, A may be necessary, but not sufficient to produce the effect. But there is another piece of information given in case 1 which eliminates A even as a necessary condition. And what is the principle applicable in this connection in case 1? In case 1 we have what? Excuse me. Is that? Excuse me. Case 3. Case 3. In case 3 we have A absent and the effect occurring. And so you say nothing can be the cause in the absence of which the effect occurs. That's just the reverse formulation of the other method. And in this case, you're eliminating via agreement. Right. Now, what about B? They says that the scientist infers that neither A nor B is the cause of it. Can we eliminate B via case 2? No, because it didn't have the effect, so that leaves the question wide open. Can we eliminate via case 3? No, because B is present and so is the effect. Can we eliminate by case 1? Obviously, again, yes, because B is absent, and yet the effect occurs. And so the principle is nothing can be the cause in the absence of which the effect occurs, and that's elimination via agreement. Right. Now we go on to the second part of this question. We assume now that A and B are out of the picture altogether. What conclusion can he come to by what method? So all we have left is dgjx, dgj, and dgjx. And in the two cases where the x is there, the effect occurred, and in the one case where the x is not there, the effect did not occur, and therefore we are using what method to establish what conclusion? Yes. Method of difference, correct. To establish what conclusion? To establish that x is the cause of E by the difference between 1 and 3, where it's the only factor that's present, that makes the difference between 1 and 3 on the one hand and 2 on the other. Now you did add correctly that x is the cause of E or an indispensable part. This information does not tell us. For all we know, D, G, and J may be necessary for the occurrence of the effect. And the whole cause may therefore be x plus D, or x plus G, or x plus D plus G, or whatever combination. To get rid of those altogether as necessary conditions, you'd have to have cases where, for instance, D did not occur, and nevertheless the effect did, and then you would have eliminated it. All right, that's just a simple symbolic exercise. Now, number 2 is a made-up one that doesn't have much plausibility, but it's simply to give you a simple example. Mr. Smith lost his glasses. And we have here, I won't read the whole thing, but in essence he reads a lot without his glasses. And then in the next paragraph he gets a lot of bad news. And the day right after the news and the morning after the reading without glasses, he has varying kinds of, what is it, headache? Dizziness. So, we have how many cases here? 3 cases, right? And if we were to symbolize this information, suppose we used R to stand for reading without glasses, and N to stand for negative news, and D to stand for dizziness. Right? Those are not very brilliant symbols, but that's good enough. In case 1, we are told that he read a great deal without glasses, 6 hours. So let's symbolize that with an R plus, indicate that's a lot. And we're told in the next paragraph that he also had some profoundly upsetting news, so let's call that N plus. That's big bad news. And the effect in those cases was what? A violent spell of dizziness, so we'll call that effect D plus. If it bothers you to call the effect D, call it E, if you insist on that, but it's easier to remember dizziness if you call it D. So we have R plus and N plus in case 1, along with the effect D plus. Now in case 2, let us call that an average amount of reading without glasses, just plain R. And he just gets moderately bad news, plain N, and he has a not so intense dizziness, plain D. And then in case 3, just a couple of hours, so we'll call that R minus, slightly disturbing news, N minus, and mild dizziness, D minus. Now there would be nothing wrong with if you had gone R double plus, R plus, R, or R triple plus, R double plus, R1 plus, since we're not mathematicizing it anyway. What is the method that is being used here? We have factors varying in degree and an effect varying in degree, and that is concomitant variations, in this case direct concomitant variations. What causal conclusion can you come to? Now we have 2 factors that varied concomitantly, both vary directly, in this case with the effect. When you have 2 concomitant variations like that, what conclusion can you come to? Well, by a show of hands in the front, yes. You can't rule either one of them out. By this method, we'd have to say there's 3 causal conclusions that are possible. Either the reading without glasses is the cause, and the news is simply an irrelevant coincidence. Or the news is the cause, and the reading without glasses is a coincidence. Or, what is also a viable possibility here, is that it's the combination of the 2. And that reading the news gets them primed for it. Reading the news. Reading gets him primed for it, and then the news is the last thing required to send him off into his dizziness, in which case the combination would be the cause. Assuming, of course, this is just a simplified example for exercise, that there are no other relevant factors and that we're appropriately analyzing this. Obviously, there would be other factors, because reading without glasses it does not in itself produce dizziness, as we know from all the negative instances of that, so you have to have a certain type of eyes, and etc. All right, now number 3 is a real example of the use of Mill's methods, and I won't begin to read all of that. The trouble with these methods in their actual use is that it takes a lot of space to copy out the example. But if you had read all that, the structure of this, there are 2 cases which are alike in at least 5 known antecedent factors. 2 groups of people each take a long air trip. So you could call that A if you're symbolizing. Each group is entirely male. That's B. Each group is healthy. That's C. That, of course, is relevant. Each group volunteered. Well, that would be D, let us say. 4. There are those 4 similar factors, antecedent factors. And now, there's one difference between the 2 groups. In case 1, they passed through many time zones. And in case 2, they didn't. And in case 1, there is a certain definite effect. Physical changes, mental deterioration. In case 2, there is no such effect. What is the obvious method that is being used? Yes, method of difference. Right, and this is a clear example. The only difference, according to this data, is the passing through many time zones, and therefore he concludes that's causally connected with the effect. Now, we are not concerned here this evening to evaluate these, because to evaluate any of Mill's methods, you would have, in their actual scientific usage, you would have to know a great deal about the subject matter. But just to give you as a caution, could you now immediately generalize? Whenever a human being passes through many time zones, he will undergo such and such an amount of physical change and mental deterioration. You couldn't, just from this data. Because what sort of questions would occur to you? Well, one obvious question is he didn't try it with women. Now, does this apply only to men, or does it apply to women also? Is age relevant? Would this be true for young babies or only for older people? In the actual example, it tells you that similar effects appeared on the return trips but didn't last as long. Well, if it's an ironclad causal connection, it's supposed to be same cause, same effect. So if you find in your actual data that the effect doesn't last as long, then that already suggests to you there's something else that must be relevant at least to the intensity of the effect that hasn't yet been identified. And you might think, just as a hypothesis, maybe they got used to it to some extent on the trip up, so the degree of their conditioning or preparedness is also relevant. We're not going to criticize and so on, but you see that there are these types of further questions you'd have to explore. And ultimately, to return to the point that I made in discussing Mill's method, you would have to have some theory about why, from the nature of human physiology and of air travel, this type of effect would take place in crossing time zones before you would have real assurance in generalizing. Although you see, this type of example can put you on the track of something, and it's typical of a controlled experiment by a difference. Now, number 4 is a simple example where the person is not attempting to establish the cause, but simply refute somebody's hypothesis. He's heard over and over again that violent movies are the cause of moral degeneracy, let us suppose. And so, I assume that because I made up this example. And he's fed up with that as an explanation, so he says, what about all the degenerates who have never seen such movies? Now, here the factors are people who have not seen violent movies, and nevertheless the effect in question, moral degeneracy, is present. So what is the principle it is using to eliminate the seeing of violent movies as the cause? Nothing can be the cause in the absence of which the effect occurs, and that is elimination via agreement. Right. Now, from just this information, have we shown that the depiction of violence in the mass media is irrelevant to moral degeneracy? No. Just movies so far. But maybe the person could come back and say, well, if it isn't movies, it's TV shorts or serials or violent novels or something of that sort. So what would you have to do if you wanted to exonerate the depiction of violence altogether as the cause of moral degeneracy? Well, you could say, what about Mr. X, who has not absorbed any violence from the media at all? He's never read any violent books or seen any violent TV shows, etc., and so on. And yet he's a blatant moral degenerate. Now, there would be a case where you're eliminating via agreement. Nothing can be the cause in the absence of which the effect occurs. Now, you can supplement that and say, on the other hand, what about Mr. Y? He's just been to, and then you can list a whole bunch of violent movies, etc., and yet he is not a moral degenerate. And if the principle of cause and effect is that they have to be coextensive, nothing can be the cause in the presence of which the effect does not occur, and now you are eliminating via difference. Right. All right, number 5. Now, 5 again is one of those real scientific ones. And I won't begin to read all of that, but the idea of it is you have a compound effect. You subject water to this process, and you end up with hydrogen and oxygen and some acid and some alkali. Now, we knew from earlier experiments that the decomposition of water by itself should yield hydrogen and oxygen. But this time, the effect has got something besides what we expect. There is a residue to the effect, namely the acid and the alkali. And we infer, therefore, the residue of the effect must be due to some new antecedents over and above the water, which accounts for the hydrogen and oxygen. Therefore, this is, in principle, the method of residues. The method of residues. Now, of course, he proceeds to use other methods of Mill in the process of trying to identify what those antecedents are. He hypothesizes, in general, a number of factors, and in each case tries to experiment to confirm or deny. Maybe the glass vessel, he thinks, is decomposing. He tries a gold vessel. Everything else the same, and doesn't affect the acid and alkali. So he concludes it's not the glass that's the cause. What is the principle that he uses to eliminate glass as a cause? Yes. Agreement. Elimination by agreement. Nothing can be the cause in the absence of which the effect still occurs. Well, he said, is it the impurity of the water? Well, let's try distilled water. And he found this time he got less acid and alkali. Still some, but less. So he infers, well, the impurity is a partial contributing cause. By what method? What is the method that he used? In this case, everything is the same as the preceding, except there's distilled water rather than ordinary water, and there's less acid and alkali. And therefore, it's the method of? No, it's not concomitant variations unless there are a number of cases going up and down by degrees. Now, you could establish concomitant variations, but that would not be this experiment. It would be concomitant variations if, for instance, you had very impure water and lots of acid and alkali, medium impure water and medium, etc. But here, it's simply impure versus pure and a certain amount versus another amount. There's only one case, one difference. There's no attempt to establish a quantitative variation, so it's simply difference. And then he tries to account for the rest. Maybe it's his hands perspiring, so he avoids contact, and he gets much less acid and alkali, so he assumes that's a major causal factor, and that's again difference. And he wants to get the last traces, so he thinks, well, maybe it's the atmosphere has impurities. He puts it in a vacuum, and now, holding all the rest constant, there's no acid or alkali at all. So he concludes that the impurity is a small contributing factor, and that is also the method of difference. Now, there's a typical use of residues. You break up your compound effect into the parts you already know, and then you try to hypothesize what is the residue of the antecedents, and then use the various other methods, agreement, difference, it could have been concomitant variations, to establish their connection. And now number 6. If poverty is the cause of crime, why doesn't everyone who is poor become a criminal? He is eliminating poverty. Poverty is present in cases where criminality is not. Nothing can be the cause in the presence of which the effect does not occur. That is elimination via difference. Right. Now, that by itself does not show that poverty is not a necessary condition. And so what data would you need to establish that poverty is not a necessary condition of criminality? You'd just point to some affluent gangster in college who is certainly not characterized by poverty and is blatantly criminal. And you would have a case in which the alleged cause is absent, poverty, but the effect is present. And so you'd say nothing can be the cause in the absence of which the effect occurs, and that is elimination via agreement. Right. Now let's look at number 7, a very dubious example. But in essence, we have here got 3 cases. The case of combat anxiety, and the effect in question is speech interference, running the whole gamut from stuttering through muteness. The case of stage fright, in which the person is unable to speak, and the case of animal fear, in which they stop, as he puts it, vocalizing. Now, there is no attempt here to draw quantitative correlation. So this is not concomitant variation. He doesn't say, for instance, utterly petrified, completely mute. Half petrified, stutters, etc. Try to give some kind of degree of intensity. So this is simply 3 cases in which he sees something in common among the effect, namely some kind of interference or cessation of speech, and something in common, therefore, among the cause, and he finds fear of some kind, and therefore he concludes that there's a causal connection between fear and speech interference. What is the method that he's using? Agreement. Right. Now, is this a valid use of Mill's method? Well, there are all sorts of questions you could raise about this particular example. That's not our purpose, but just to give you an indication. Does fear inhibit only vocal behavior just because he happened to get a grant from the Ford Foundation to study only vocal behavior? Or does it interfere with all voluntary behavior? What is the proper level on which to draw the effect? Is fear sufficient to produce the stoppage of the speaking? Or is it perhaps necessary but not sufficient? And there's some other factor. For instance, in the case of human beings, is the state of your premises and your general philosophic firmness and your self-confidence relevant? He doesn't even consider any such question. He right away jumps to fear has an innate tendency. In other words, he assumes automatically there's something physiological, leaving out of account the possibility that in the case of humans, there is something learned about it. So from this, you could assert no causal connection. The most you could say is, this data, as it presently stands, suggests vaguely some kind of link between fear and inhibition of vocal activity. But what kind of link, in what species, under what conditions, all of that is left untouched until you do much more work, and again, until you are able to specify what is the method by which fear functions so that it would produce this effect in a living creature. If you can't, till you can do that, you don't have anything but a few empirical observations. Number 8, this is Pliny the Elder's refutation of astrology. And he says, if a man's destiny is caused by the star under which he's born, then all men born under that star should have the same fortune. But here are all these men with different fortunes, masters, slaves, kings, and beggars born under the same star at the same time. So here they are born under the same star. If the effect in question is, let us say, good fortune, well, it comes under star X, but it also its opposite, non-good fortune, as represented by slaves and beggars, comes under occurs when the antecedent factor is star x. And so you say the star can't be the cause of the good fortune. Why not? Nothing can be the cause in the presence of which the effect does not occur. Elimination via difference. The idea, of course, that he's using, although he doesn't at this time in human history formulate it as such, is that the same cause should yield the same effect. So if a given factor is not present when an effect occurs, then that factor can't be the cause. And now case 9, the pituitary gland. And we have essentially here 4 cases. The giant is case 1. And if we let P stand for the size of the pituitary gland, he's got one the size of a hen's egg, so let's give that P++. And of course the effect in this case is body growth. Let's symbolize that by G, and that'll be G++. After all, he's a giant. Now then he refers to the normal person, which is case 2. And his pituitary is something about a half a gram. So since that's normal, we'll call that plain P. And of course, the effect in question is the normal body growth, plain ordinary G. Now we get to acromegaly, case 3, a tumor of the pituitary. Now there's no convenient way to mathematicize that. But if the giant one is P++, let's say this is P+, just 1 plus. And here the effect is, well, his extremities are enlarged, but he's not a giant, so we'll call him G+. And then on the other hand, we have the dwarf, case 4, a much smaller atrophied pituitary, P-, and of course he's a dwarf, G-. So we have what method? Yes. Concomitant variations, in this case also direct. Both go up or down together. Now again, before you could draw this causal conclusion, you would have to ask many questions. Is the variation in the pituitary the only relevant factor? Is he maybe reversing cause and effect? Maybe there's some other hidden factor, Z, which is causing 2 effects simultaneously. Body growth effects and the size of the pituitary effect. And therefore, there is a hidden factor. Or maybe the hidden factor is directly causing the body growth, which in turn is redounding on the pituitary. From just this information, you cannot tell. But of course, it's a promising lead for subsequent theorizing and experimentation. And that's all we're using it for. And now finally, the example from Hazlit. He wants to show that war is not the cause of inflation. And he gives us 2 cases in the excerpt I chose, Chile and Bolivia, both of them untouched by war in a given period, both of them characterized by the effect in question, rampant inflation. And his reasoning is war can't be the cause, because nothing can be the cause in the absence of which the effect occurs, which is elimination via agreement. Right. Now you might argue there's a lead here, although I didn't quote enough to develop it, to a method of establishing the actual cause of inflation, rather than simply eliminating war. In Chile, it tells us the money supply went up 19 times, that's the antecedent factor, and the cost of living went up 20 times. In Bolivia, the money supply went up 70 times, and the cost of living went up 100 times. Now, if we brought in a whole bunch of other countries, including United States, we can make a whole chart, and we would see what phenomenon, as the cost of living goes, as the money supply rather goes up, the inflation goes up. As the money supply goes down, the inflation goes down. And we could therefore establish a causal connection in this case by what method? Concomitant variations. Right. We have a lead, in other words, to the real method. All right. Are there any questions on these 10 examples? Yes. Number 9, yes. Well, you want to know, that's a physical question which I don't know, so I'll just comment on the logic of it. You say, if the size of the body, to put it abstractly, is related to the size of all the glands, then of course this proves nothing, because if his liver and his kidneys and etc. are all equally enlarged relative to his body size, why do you pick on the pituitary? And of course that's perfectly irrelevant question. And therefore you'd have to assume that they have either, I do not know the physiology, but either the pituitary notably varies in relation to body size, whereas the others remain approximately the normal size, or else we have from other knowledge discovered that there's no connection between kidneys and liver, etc. But you see, as soon as you go into the examples, you plunge into where you have to know the actual example, the actual information, and it's not, that's outside the province here. I'll take one more. If you think that it raises a point of more general interest than simply an attack on the details of one example. I know that's inhibiting as a comment, but all right. Let us look at the 4 definitions that we have left, and those are on page 9. Starting on 25, page 9. Education is any process of acquiring knowledge. Who has any objection to that definition? Yes. Any process is too broad. Yes. Why is it too broad? But you say any action can be called a process. You want to restrict it to a human? Can animals be educated? Well, what you say any human action would be a process, what would you restrict it to? Well, you say it should be at least an intellectual process, but that's really, to an extent, if we leave out animals, that's involved in the idea of the process of acquiring knowledge. I agree with you, this is too wide, but I think the obvious reason why it's too wide is that this would mean if you look up a number in a phone book, that's education. And then there would be no such thing as an uneducated man, because everybody goes through some process of acquiring knowledge. So there would be no distinction between having knowledge and having an education, in which case the concept of education would become superfluous. Now, if you ask me in what direction, remembering that we're not here concerned to give a precise definition, but in what direction one should go, I would say that education would have to involve not simply the acquisition of any knowledge by any means, but it would involve the acquisition of general knowledge, general principles, as against simply stray facts, and above all, the development of the powers of reasoning, which I think is vital, so that what the person has when he's educated is not simply a collection of memorized information, but an education, where he's actually able to use his mind. Now, to acquire general knowledge and develop your process of reasoning, obviously, involves some kind of systematic pursuit of knowledge, some sort of structured pursuit. And therefore, I would say that in a proper definition of education, you'd have to include the ideas of a systematic or structured, deliberate pursuit of general knowledge and of the developing one's powers of reasoning. Now, by systematic here, I should indicate I don't mean the same as formal. There is such a thing as a self-educated man. Education doesn't have to be formal in the sense that you enroll for a course or go to a school. But it does have to be systematic, I would argue, in the sense that even if you do it yourself, you have to follow some structure and build one point on another. Now, the relevance of this, of course, is if you use the definition that was cited here in number 25, any process of acquiring knowledge, that's exactly what the colleges operate on today. They have these stray, grab bag, memorized survey courses. They're opposed to curricular structure or any hierarchy of material. Anything and everything is thrown in or out on the name of some spurious relevance, and they say, well, the students are learning something. Well, they're learning something, but they are not getting an education. 26. Garbage is what you throw out after a meal. Now, that's obviously deficient. What is wrong with this one? Who has an idea? in the front, yes.
First of all, it
Has no genus. The genus here is what? And therefore there's no genus at all. What else is wrong with it?
what you throw out after a meal is not fundamental. It's true of garbage, that it's not what garbage.
Well, is it even necessarily true of all garbage? Now remember, we're not using garbage in its metaphorical sense here. You know, where you say his theory is garbage. We mean plain ordinary garden variety garbage. No, you could argue, well, some garbage you leave overnight, so you don't throw it out right away, so it's too narrow. But of course, the big deficiency is that, besides having no genus, is much too wide. Anything you throw out after a meal becomes garbage. If you throw out your potato peeler or your wife, that becomes garbage by that reason. So there's no indication. And of course, you know, whenever it violates the rule of equivalence, it automatically violates the rule of fundamentality. As a direction, one dictionary that I looked at suggested that it's waste animal or vegetable matter from a kitchen. That sounds jazzy to me, so I'm prepared to accept that, at least as a direction. 27. Now, I don't want to argue about garbage. 27. Chance is the fortuitous or accidental events in the world. What is wrong with this one? Yes. You say it's circular. Why is it circular? So, right. Fortuitous and accidental are both synonyms for chance, so this is circular twice. It simply is chance are those events which occur in the world by chance or by chance. And that, of course, tells you zero. Now, of course, if you were to give a positive definition of chance, it first of all depends on are you using it in its metaphysical or epistemological sense. In its metaphysical sense, a chance event is an uncaused event. Simply a bolt from the blue that has no cause. And of course, on the objectivist metaphysics, that's a non-existent. There is no such thing. Consequently, the concept is void. However, there is a valid use in the epistemological sense where chance designates an event whose cause is unknown by human beings and which event was therefore unpredictable to them at that stage of knowledge. So when you throw dice and you say by chance it came out 7, you mean I did not know all the original conditions and pressure factors and so on, and therefore I had no way of predicting. It was simply by chance. Whereas on the other hand, if you could take all those initial measurements and measure all the relevant forces, you could say, as a physicist, there's no question of chance here, you know. So in that sense, chance, as a valid sense, simply designates those cases where the cause is unknown, and therefore you were unable to predict. Finally, now, to read is to move one's eyes in order over a written or printed series of words in a language one knows. Well, of course, the first question I'd ask is, a language one knows what about? Language one knows how to read? Then, of course, it is circular. A language one knows how to speak? Not necessarily. Then it's too wide. There are many cases where you can speak a language and you can't read it. But the major flaw is that this definition is, well, let's get the minor flaw out of the way first. You have to make a decision in principle. What are you going to do with things like Braille and lip reading, etc.? Now, they have obviously certain similarities and certain differences. But here, I would tend to follow what we did with sandwich. I define the root concept and recognize that there are subcategories and derivatives of it, like Braille and lip reading, etc. Not mind reading, however. But what then is the major flaw of this? It's much too wide. It leaves out one crucial thing, which is the essence of reading. It gives you the form without the essence. And what is that, the lady? Exactly. It leaves out comprehension. It leaves out grasping the meaning and understanding. If you simply move your eyes, even if it's a language you can speak and even if it's a language you can read, there are any number of people who do that when their mind is elsewhere and their eyes are simply moving. While they may be engaged in eye exercises or time wasting, they are not reading. So if you were reconstructing this definition, you would have to include as essential grasping the meaning of conceptually formulated material by visual means, if we're leaving out Braille. That would be essential to reading. All right, I have now got exactly 16 minutes before the hour, so on the stroke of the hour, we'll take up the homework on analogies. Since that gives you 2 minutes apiece, don't spend longer. If you're stuck on one, just go on. All right, let us pick up. And before we take up these analogies, I will make the announcements which I said at the outset that I would. To begin with, I would like to say that I appreciate the interest of all those people who have sent me written questions throughout the course which I have studiously ignored, asking for the publication date of my book. I now have a tentative answer that I can give, inasmuch as I had a chance to meet with my publisher just this last week and discuss the question with him. And given what I estimate as the time involved to complete it, I have in effect agreed to deliver the manuscript to the publisher by the fall of next year, that is 1975. It then takes about 6 to 8 months after that for it to go through the publication process, and therefore I now expect that it will actually appear in the spring of 1976. This I have to say is tentative. It's conceivable that it could be sooner, but highly unlikely, and it's conceivable that it could be later, but I think that would not be likely either. This is my best estimate, and the announcement when things are more definite will be made in the Ayn Rand letter calendar. Now, with regard to further courses, in order for me to complete the manuscript, which has now grown to expectation that the final book will be something on the order of 700 pages, I have decided not to give any courses at all in 1975 or in this year, 1974. At least I will say that it is extraordinarily unlikely that I will. Of course, the tapes of the 2 history courses and this course are available, but I'm talking about no new live courses. I will, however, offer a course in 1976, I think in the spring, and it will be a 12-lecture course live in New York City under the title Introduction to Objectivism. And it will consist of a systematic presentation in order of objectivism's philosophy, that is, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics, presenting in each case the arguments, how the positions interconnect with the others, examples, applications, and so on, from scratch. As I say, that is tentatively scheduled for spring of 76, and again, it will be announced in the Ayn Rand letter calendar at an appropriate time. Now, I am, however, happy to be able to announce that a new course will be given this year, almost exactly 6 months from tonight, and that is a course that will be given by Dr. Alan Blumenthal. Dr. Blumenthal will offer a 12-lecture course entitled Music, Its Theory, History, and Performance. And that will begin in New York City on Tuesday, September 17 of this year, 1974. The material will be illustrated by performances and demonstrations, both live and recorded. Included in the course will be a discussion of the nature of music, the response to music, and the development of the techniques of musical expression from ancient Greece to the 20th century. Dr. Blumenthal will discuss the relationship of the advances in music to achievements in the other arts, the styles of significant composers, the roles of the interpretive artist, the conductor, and the listener. As to details regarding enrollment procedures, either for the live course in New York City or the tape courses which will be available outside of the New York area, that information will appear in an announcement in a forthcoming issue of the Ayn Rand letter. And I might mention that those people who are the Ayn Rand letter subscribers in the New York City area will receive a brochure describing the course and the enrollment procedures, and that I think is being sent out in July of this year. So there will be something this fall. Now let us look at analogies. And we start with number 1 on page 12 from David Hume. Now, I should say, out of fairness to Hume, to whom it's difficult to be fair, but we should be, that he does not subscribe to this analogy. He puts this in simply in order to refute it subsequently, so don't think that he believes in this one. Now, the first question in regard to an analogy is, what are the two things being compared? And what is the answer in this case? Yes, sir. All right, a machine in the world or the universe. Right. What is the characteristic, as he words it, that we know to be the same in both cases? That we know to be the same, that therefore constitute our premises. Yes, the gentleman. Yes, in both cases there is an adapting of means to ends. What is the characteristic that we know to be true of machines, and which is therefore inferred to be true of the universe?
They are both products of conscious intelligence.
They are both products of a conscious intelligence, or mind created, or intelligence made, etc. Now, before we analyze this analogy, or any one, the first thing you have to ask is, are the premises true? Do they state uncontestable facts? Because if the known similarities aren't true, of course your whole foundation is wiped out. Now, is it true? We're talking about the universe as a whole now, the inanimate universe. Is it true to state that it displays an adaptation of means to ends? Well, obviously, you could immediately raise an enormous question if anybody formulated the point that way. Because means and ends are categories applicable only where purpose is applicable. Means and ends, that relationship is not the same as simply orderly, regular, lawful, uniform, etc. Means and ends is already a specific type of order which implies a purpose of mind. Well, if you're going to say in your premise the universe exhibits means and ends, you are committing then what fallacy if your goal is to prove that it's run by a mind? You're begging the question. You're assuming the point at issue. So we better reformulate the known similarity here to get rid of that. So let us say, to be charitable, because this is the more common formulation of it, what a machine and a universe both have in common is that they're lawful, orderly, regular, uniform, etc. Now, before we go any further, we have to be sure what is the conclusion that he's claiming. He says both of them must have been created or produced by a mind or an intelligence. Well, now, the sense in which this is applicable to a machine, the intelligence doesn't create it out of a void. It simply assembles pre-existing ingredients in a new combination. Is that all he means? Or when he talks about the intelligence, or what is the word, the author here, of nature, does he mean the good Jewish Christian author, good old-fashioned Jewish Christian author, who creates it ex nihilo out of a void? Because if it's that, then of course it's not even the same characteristic that they're trying to state in the conclusion. So we have to give the benefit of the doubt here, and let's assume that this argument is being used only to show that there is an intelligence which ordered the material of the world, not one that created it from scratch, because there's nothing in this analogy to found that. Well, given that interpretation, we've now rectified the premise so it's acceptable, and we've taken out a possible equivocation in the conclusion. What is the implicit generalization? Well, that depends exactly on how you word the known similarity, but it would be something like this. Everything which is lawful, or orderly, or regular, or uniform, is so because a mind has ordered it. That would be the generalization. Is that a valid generalization? Obviously. What? Yes or no? No. Why not? Well, for one obvious reason. There is a basic metaphysical principle which accounts for law, order, regularity, and uniformity without requiring reference to any mind. What principle? The law of cause and effect. If you hold an Aristotelian or objectivist metaphysics on this point, you will say that it's certainly not true that wherever there is law, there must be a mind imposing that law, Because you'll say that causality is the source of law, and causality itself is simply an expression of the law of identity, which is inherent in anything existing. So where does the idea of a mental orderer or an intelligence come up? Only where there is a special type of order, kind of order which involves the expression of purposeful action. And then, of course, you would have to have a mind capable of conceiving and executing that purpose. Now, that sort of order is present in a machine, but is not in the universe. And therefore, you would say this analogy fails via a crucial disanalogy. The type of order in question for machines is not applicable to the universe. Do I have a question from anybody on this example? All right, so this is a poor analogy. This, by the way, is known as the argument from design. And the world is designed, therefore there must be a designer. And it's a poor analogy. It goes way back to the pre-Socratic. Number 2, why bother about the cause of mental illness? What counts is to cure it. As Dr. William Menninger has said, you don't have to know the cause of a fire to put it out. And I gather he really did say this. What are the two things being compared here? Anybody? At the very back, the gentleman.
Cause of fire with a cause of illness?
Well, you don't have to put cause of fire and cause of mental illness. The two things being compared are simply fire and mental illness. Fire and mental illness. And generally, you're better if you're writing it down to put down first the thing where you know the conclusion. And because that's the thing from which you're really generalizing. And then second, the thing you want to prove something about. So case 1 here is fire and case 2 is mental illness. What are the characteristics that we know to be the same in both? Now, he doesn't tell you at all. He doesn't say a word here about what is the same in both. But there's obviously something he is implying is the same in both. That is true of fire and true of mental illness. What is that characteristic? Yes? Chaos? Oh, well, chaos is pretty vague. Fires might be. You might have a neat fire. So I don't think... chaos makes it just so vague that there's... Yes?
They're undesirable and curable.
All right, you say they're undesirable and curable. Perhaps curable wouldn't be exactly the word in as much as you don't cure a fire, but let us say eradicable. There are things you want to get rid of. Now, you don't want to say undesirable because not all fires are undesirable, and you don't want to commit them to that. So let us make it simple and say there's a characteristic that's unquestionable here. Something you want to eradicate or terminate or stop. That's it. That's really what he tells us or implies. And what is the characteristic that he claims is present in the case of fire and therefore infers will be present in the case of mental illness? That in order to stop it, what? Yes, that a knowledge of its cause is unnecessary, is needless to its eradication. What then is the implicit generalization? Whenever you want to eradicate something, it is unnecessary to know its cause. A knowledge of the cause of a phenomenon is unessential or dispensable in the effort to eradicate the phenomenon. Now, of course, if he had come out, you see, and uttered a generalization like this, he couldn't possibly have completed his analogy because everyone would leap at him and say, that's fantastic. And they'd give all the examples of diseases and plagues, etc., that you cannot eliminate until you know the cause. So he has to, and I don't here impute evil motives to him, but I'm speaking simply of the overt method, you have to, in a case like this, insinuate the generalization by jumping straight from fire to mental illness without stating explicitly on what principle you're counting. Now, of course, once the principle is named, you immediately attack it. And, of course, one of the best ways to attack it is attack it right on its own home ground. That is, attack it even on the example given, because then, of course, you don't even have to look farther afield. You wipe it out of his own mouth. Now, is it even true of all fires that you can eliminate them or eradicate them without knowing the cause? Well, what about if you have an epidemic of fires? Now, you might be able to observe simply empirically without understanding that if you toss water on a given fire, it'll go out in some cases, but not in all cases. But even so, you cannot stop an epidemic of fires until you learn, is there a mad arsonist loose? Is there some kind of chemical leakage, or what? So even in the case of fires, this proposition is enormously dubious, and there are many cases where it isn't true. But let's grant him. Suppose it was true of an isolated, normal garden variety fire. You don't have to know the chemistry involved in what causes it. You just have to pour water on it. What is wrong with applying that to mental illness? What is an essential disanalogy, a huge disanalogy in this case? I'm trying to get somebody new. All right, this gentleman, yes.
But you know how to put a button. Regardless of whether you know the partner, you know.
Well, you say we know how to put out a fire, and he says, presumably, and he would go on and say that we know how to put out mental illness too. Now, I don't know his theory, but someone like him would say, just love the patient. And therefore, you know how to put out mental illness. Yes.
Well, I'm going to say that any fire requires three things, regardless of the type of fire it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
An oxygen.
Right.
So we can keep the pure.
But he is saying, you're telling me what the causes of a fire are, but he is saying even when we didn't know about kindling temperature and oxygen and so on, we could still put out fires. And therefore, why can't we in the case of mental illness, even if we have no idea where they come from, at the back?
You can't compare fires to mental illness.
Well, that's the whole point, yes. You can't compare fire to mental illness. Why not? What is the essential difference?
Because one's a person.
Well, you say because one is a person and the other is a fire. Well, I mean, that's true. You can put it perhaps a little more simply by saying, what is the essence of curing a mental illness? It's not simply treating its symptoms. The essence of curing a mental illness is grasping and removing the mental malfunctioning which caused it. Now, this is within the objectivist framework, at least. And therefore, from that point of view, it is fantastic. We're talking here about neurosis. It is fantastic to talk about curing a mental illness without affecting knowing its cause, because to cure is to remove certain kind of premises in psychoepistemology, etc., which are its cause. And therefore, there's a fantastic disanalogy. Or we don't have to labor this one. Let's pause for a moment while the tape is turned, and that'll give you another chance to look at Plato or go on. All right, let us turn to Plato. This is the argument which endears him to women's rights advocates. He is regarded as one of the earliest, if not the earliest, in Western philosophy to argue that women should be treated the same as men. And this is the famous passage in the Republic where he puts forth the analogy. What is the analogy between, in this case? Yes, sir. Dogs and human beings. Now, what characteristics do we know are the same in these two cases? Yes. Both have two sexes. They divide into male and female. Is there any other similarity that he states we know? Yeah, there's one other that he states that we know. And that is yes. In other words, both species, the sexes differ in their reproductive functions. One, the male begets and how does he put it, and the woman bears. Right. You might also mention that he points out that they differ also in strength within each species. So you could say that the similarities that we know between the two species are they're divided into male and female, and in both cases that difference affects only strength and reproductive function. That's what we know. Now, what is the conclusion? The characteristic that he says should be similar in the two cases. Yes.
The activities of both sexes can overlap.
Well, a little stronger than that the activities of the two sexes can overlap. If we put it in modern terms, that there should be no sexual discrimination. In other words, that women should share alike in the training and pursuits of men, or putting it more broadly to cover both cases, females should share in the same training and life activities as men. What is the implicit generalization? Whenever a species is divided into male and female, and is such that the difference between the two sexes is a matter only of strength and reproductive activities, then the two sexes within that species should share alike in training and the pursuits of life. That, you see, is a huge mouthful, but that is the implicit generalization. Now, what do you think of that? How many of you find that a good analogy? Let us see by a show of hands. Now, I'm not asking you, do you agree with the conclusion? You can have a bad argument for a good conclusion, for a true conclusion. So I'm not asking you, do you believe women should take the same pursuits? I want to know how many think this is actually a good analogy. Let me see again. I see many fewer. Oh, all right. And how many think this is not a good analogy? Many more think it's not a good analogy. Well, I would agree that it is not a good analogy. At least not without some further development. Why not? Who wants to volunteer of those who think it's not a good analogy? A gentleman at the very back. Yeah. We won't commit ad hominem, so we won't assume that you are prejudiced against women. All right. Yes.
Quite often they are free will.
You say animals are determined and human beings have free will, so there is a disanalogy between the two cases. Well, that is certainly a valid point, but the question is it a disanalogy that affects the conclusion? Now, there are a terrific number of differences between any two things. Even one book of Agatha Christie and a second. One might have Jane Marple and the other might have Hercule Poirot. So dogs and humans can differ in vast number of ways, but the question is, have you put your finger on a disanalogy that upsets the conclusion? Now, as you stated, I don't see that you have. However, I think you're on the track of something. And the way I would summarize the general problem with this analogy is this. It is never safe to put forth an analogy between two things which omits a reference to the essential characteristic of one of the things. Now, in this case, there is no reference to the essential characteristic of man, namely his possession of a rational faculty. I'm not saying yet that that invalidates the analogy, but simply, you can never have an analogy between two things which will hold until you check whether reference to the essential alters the case. For instance, in the case of the bees analogy that we took, the reference to the essential wiped the analogy out. Now, I could give you the same analogy as Plato, and you certainly would not like it. For instance, in the case of dogs, they're divided into male and female. They differ only in strength and reproductive activities. And we chain both sexes up at night. Therefore, the same in the case of humans. Now, you would say that's obviously a very poor analogy, and you'd say there's a difference. Dogs are animals, and human beings have the capacity to reason. There you see the essential would wipe out, the reference to the essential wipe out the analogy. Now, in this case, the conclusion, I think, is certainly valid, because the possession of a rational faculty does not affect it. It's like the issue of free will that the gentleman raised. It's true that human beings have that, but that possession of a rational faculty is not sexually slanted. It's possessed equally by men and women, and therefore is no basis for sexual discrimination. But the thing to note here is that even if we say it, well, this analogy is then okay having gone through this process, as an analogy, it proves nothing. It does not prove that you should treat women the same as men. Because someone could argue, just because we treat dogs that way, it doesn't follow that we should treat women that way. And you would then have to get involved in an argument on the substance of the point. And here the essential point that you'd have to discuss is sex relevant to ethics? That is, to the basic principles by which a human being should raise his life. And you would have the advocates of the so-called feminine mystique and many advocates of women's lib against you, arguing that biology is destiny and that sex makes an essential difference to the principles by which you should follow your life, in which case you'd have to argue that principle on its own ground and establish that sex is irrelevant to the principles of ethics and therefore the two sexes should live the same life. But the point I'm trying to make is that the reference to dogs does not prove it. The analogy as such proves nothing. All it does is illustrate a case. Call it to your attention, and then you have to justify your conclusion by whatever means are available to you, if it can be. Number 4, George G. Nathan. This is condensed from a longer and much more sarcastic statement, but this is the idea of it. What is being compared here? What are the cases? Now, you could look at this in two somewhat different ways, but it comes to the same analogy. Give me, anybody, what is one way you could look at this? The gentleman on the aisle. All right, give me the one always that we know the conclusion of first. So smallpox and bad art. Or you could say a disease and a bad play if we want to generalize. Or if you wanted to look at the same analogy from another point of view, namely of the human being who is judging the thing rather than the thing being judged, you could say it's an analogy between a doctor and a critic, right? So that it wouldn't affect the analogy, it would simply affect your formulation of it. But let's say we take it between a doctor and a critic. What are the characteristics that we know are true of both in this example? Now again, he doesn't tell us, but what do you think would be implied? What do we know is true of a doctor and a critic? Yes. All right, look at it then as a smallpox and a bad play or disease. They're both something you want to avoid, or they're both negative, or they're both bad in some sense. And what else? Now you're going to have to, I think, get in one other characteristic. Although it's, yes.
They both involve evaluation as part of the doctor.
They both involve an evaluation, let us say, by a specialist. Let us give them the benefit of the doubt and say a critic is like the doctor of the theater, you see, and that he's a specialist in that field. And so let us, if we use the doctor-critic formulation, say that there's two characteristics. Both are specialists in their field. Both encounter a negative case that they want to eradicate. Or no, yes, let us say eradicate or inform people about. And what is true in the doctor case? When that specialist encounters a negative case, what does he have to do? Yes. He simply gives it a terse label, a one-word verdict. And therefore the conclusion is that's what the critic should do too. What is then the implicit generalization? Whenever a specialist encounters a negative case, a bad case within his field, all he should do is give it a one-word label. That's all. No explanations, etc. are required. Is this a good analogy? How many think yes? How many think no? Obviously, all do. Very poor analogy. Why? On what grounds would you argue against this? In the front, yes.
Well, the layman can understand what's wrong with the play if it's explained to him, but he may not understand the nature of smallpox.
Well, you say that there's a disanalogy because the explanation of smallpox may be too complex for the layman, whereas the layman can certainly understand the kind of points that would be involved in giving, of a critic giving his analysis. So you could say there's a disanalogy. The doctor, there'd be not much point giving a medical dissertation because it wouldn't be understood, whereas that's inapplicable to the critic. That's a possible point. I think there are other points you could make that are disanalogies between the two cases besides the issue of the layman's ease. This gentleman.
Well, I think that anybody would agree with smallpox. But the critic, why some people don't.
Well, now you raise an interesting point. You say the smallpox is objective. Anybody would agree it's smallpox, whereas the critic, I didn't hear what you said, but the idea is it's a matter of taste or his viewpoint. Well, there you run into a point that is valid combined with a questionable formulation. There is this difference. Given the state of medicine as a science today, there are certain standards that reputable doctors adhere to. And if they put up smallpox over a house without further explanation, that is good grounds to assume that they are following certain objective standards. Within the case of critics today, however, the situation is completely the reverse. Critics today are beneath where doctors were before Hippocrates. And consequently, when the critic gives his verdict, you haven't the faintest clue of what it means. Now, I would not say that that is inherent in any society, and that criticism must be subjective, but I would say a whole philosophy is involved. And in any society, even an objectivist one, there would be no way of knowing on what philosophy his verdict was based if he simply said, what is it, tripe or something like that, or junk. There would be no way of knowing on what his philosophy was based, and therefore what that verdict meant. And consequently, there's a huge disanalogy between the two. You might also point out still another disanalogy, the purpose of the two professions. The doctor is simply to warn people away, to save them from getting in a physical disease. Presumably one of the purposes of the critic is to give an intellectual evaluation, define standards, and thereby help to raise the level of the theater, none of which can be done if he simply opens his mouth and says junk. So there are a terrific number of disanalogies here. All right, number 5. Now, number 5 is just the way people state analogies if they do not want the general principle stated. Because if it was stated, it simply collapses. And therefore, usually the briefer an analogy, the less they even tell you what they have the same. They just simply throw a couple of quick similarities at you without any further elaboration, the worse. Now, here it's a tripartite or threefold analogy, 3 cases. It is an analogy between 3 relationships. So this is a relational analogy. And what 3 relationships are being compared? 1, the relation of a nursemaid to a baby. 2, the relation of a teacher to college student. 3, the relation of government to its citizens. So the analogy says, nursemaid is to baby, as teacher is to college student, as government is to citizen. So that's 3 cases. Now what do we know to be the same? In the nursemaid baby, the teacher college student, and the government citizen case. What do we know to be the same? He does not tell us. Has left entirely to implication. So you have to say something woozy and generalize that you know uncontroversially would be the same in the 3 cases. For instance, what? Yes?
Well, some sort of guidance or overall direction.
That's the best you could say. The first in each case, in some sense, guides or controls or directs or supervises certain acts of the second. That's all. You can't specify, because as soon as you specify, it won't be true of one of these relationships. What is the conclusion that he claims we know to be true in 2 cases, and it follows, therefore, in the 3rd case? Yes.
No one who receives guidance is competent to select the guidance.
No one who receives such guidance is competent to select the guidance. So if we use 1 for the nursemaid, teacher, or government, and 2 for the baby, college student, or citizen, then selection of 1 by 2 is foolish. So you could put it that way just to simplify. What is the implicit generalization? Now that takes you have to take a deep breath because it's a long sentence, but the idea is like this. Whenever human beings are so related that one of them, one or a group of them, controls or supervises or in some sense guides the acts of others, then it is always foolish for those others to have a voice in the selection of the ones who are doing the guiding or supervising. That is the general principle, you see. That is implied. Now, what do you say about this analogy? You see, he would never utter that analogy if he had to state the general principle explicitly, if for no other reason than it's simply too long. But beyond that, it's obviously ridiculous. What is the problem with this analogy? Yes.
In the cases he gives, the guiders have their position because they have greater knowledge than those they guide.
Yes, you say in the cases he gives, the guiders have their position because they have greater knowledge. They're older, they're more mature, they have more knowledge than the college student or the baby. Whereas you obviously imply this is clearly not applicable to the government, which is not, as an institution, older, wiser, or more mature than the citizens, since it's simply comprised of the citizens. So there's a vast disanalogy here. Can anybody think of a second disanalogy? I mean, quite different in kind from this point. Yes?
I think it's using government as an entity when it's really a concept.
You say he's using government as an entity when it's only a concept. Well, actually, he doesn't even use the word government. Oh, yes, he does. But it's a little peculiar to contrast concept and entity, because presumably he'd say it's a concept standing for an entity. Now, your point would be, well, the government is simply a group of people. Okay, well, even so. Nursemaids are a group of people, and teachers are a group of people. So how does that invalidate the analogy?
Well, I'm thinking of government more as an abstraction rather than something like concrete, like a group of people.
Well, you say you're thinking of government as an abstraction, but actually abstractions don't exist. What actually exists are concrete government officials, and presumably that's what he is referring to. Now, I think there is another definite difference. Yes? Are supposed to rule you? Oh, you say the point about government is it's supposed to serve you and not rule you, whereas nursemaids and teachers are supposed to guide you. Well, I think you're aiming for what I would regard as a central difference, and that is in the baby and the college cases, the relationship is still voluntary. Only it may be voluntary one step removed. The baby, for instance, doesn't choose his own nursemaid. But then, until he grows of age, that nursemaid is justified only because of the approval of the parents. And in that sense, it still has to receive the parents' consent, who are therefore surrogates for the child in this connection. And in that respect, those two cases are still voluntary. Well, what he's really doing is arguing from a relationship which is essentially voluntary, therefore, from two relationships which are voluntary, to the conclusion that the government should be involuntary. So that is a complete switch and a complete reversal of the proper function of government, if you hold the objectivist view of what the function of government should be, namely to preserve individual rights and prevent compulsion. But of course, to elaborate that point, you'd have to start arguing the functions of government. Number 6. How is this for an argument for immortality? Now, you can take as many or as few cases as you want here, but so as not to spend too much time, the way I took it is the heart of the analogy is the leaf to the tree. This is again a relational analogy. It is saying the leaf is to the tree as art is to the artist. And that way we can condense those cases of In Memoriam and St. Paul's Cathedral and Raphael. Instead of listing them all separately, we just condense them all into art. And if you want to, you can include his sentence, if thoughts live, the thinker cannot die, as a somewhat different version of art to the artist. That would be thoughts to the thinker. And therefore, he's really got three relationships again. The leaf is to the tree, as art is to the artist, as thoughts are to the thinker. Now, what is the characteristic that we know is the same in all three relationships? The uncontroversial characteristic. Well, again, as in case 5, you're going to have to say it in a very generalized way. How would you put it? Yes. In all cases, the first is in some sense produced by or dependent for its creation on the second. And what is the conclusion that he's arguing will have to be true of all cases? Because it's true of the leaf case, yes. Right. That the continued existence of the first presupposes the continued existence of the second. Now, if you try to state that connection as an implicit generalization, it would be something like this. In all cases where something is produced by or dependent for its creation on something else, then the thing produced can continue in existence only so long as the producer continues in existence, which again is a massive mouthful. And of course, what is the huge disanalogy in these two cases? Or three cases, the leaf case on the one hand and the art and thoughts case on the other. There is one massive disanalogy which wipes out the whole point. Yes? But you say an animate product versus an inanimate one. That's essentially on the track. The way I would formulate it is the leaf is a literal organic part of the tree, and obviously can't therefore live when severed from the whole, just as if you plucked your liver out and threw it on the ground, it wouldn't be a living liver anymore. But the art is not an organic part of the artist, nor are thoughts, if you're thinking now of the physical expression of the thoughts and not the actual mental process. The thoughts are not an organic part of the thinker. They are distinct products, and therefore they, after they were created, they can continue with their own independent reality apart from their creator. And so it's a complete difference between a part to a whole and a product to a creator. And therefore, the thing collapses. And now number 7. What do you think of this one? Determinism means the destruction of morality, just as you cannot hold an animal which doesn't have choice responsible. So, if man's behavior is completely determined, you can't hold him responsible. How many think that's a good analogy? How many think that's a bad analogy? Well, we have the unanimity that this is a good analogy. And here the structure is very simple. Animals are being compared to men. What do we claim to be the same in both cases? That they're determined. Now here, of course, he wants to, he doesn't say that man is determined. He's simply trying to show the connection. So he says, let's assume that man is determined just for purposes of the argument. What is the characteristic that we know is true of animals and we're inferring to be true of men? That they can't be responsible. What is the general principle? A determined entity is not responsible for its actions. Now, in this case, the general principle is correct. Therefore, you could say this is a valid analogy. Now, again, you'd have to refer, as I mentioned earlier, to the essential characteristic of man, his possession of a rational faculty, but in this case, that would not alter the conclusion, because even if he has a mental conceptual faculty, but if it were completely determined, so that its operation was out of his control, he obviously couldn't be held responsible for what he does on its basis. Therefore, the rational faculty in this case does not affect the analogy. Now notice again, although it's a perfectly good analogy, it does not prove anything. It simply illustrates the general principle in an obvious case and helps to make it clearer. But if you wanted to argue, you'd have to show why inherent in the thing being determined is the destruction of morality. You have to argue morality presupposes choice, determinism is incompatible with choice, and so on. So again, it's a valid analogy, but by itself it does not prove anything. It simply illustrates the principle. And finally, Abraham Lincoln and Blondin. And he has this tightrope walker going across Niagara Falls. I think this was during the Civil War. And he compares Blondin to the United States government. And what do we know is common to both? They're both engaged in a perilous feat. In both cases, let us say an enormous treasure is at stake. And what do we know is true in the Blondin case? Onlookers should keep their mouths shut. What does he conclude is true in the government case? Same. So what's the implicit generalization? Whenever a human being or group is engaged in a perilous feat with an enormous treasure at stake, onlookers, no matter of what kind or how involved, should keep quiet. Now, if you put, as soon as you see you put the whenever in and you make it a generalization, refutations leap to mind. In this case, there are obvious, crucial disanalogies. Walking across a tightrope is a single physical action, which is essentially irrevocable once you've started it. Whereas a war or a governmental policy such as this kind is a whole series of actions across time, which is a big difference, because it means that in the Blondin case, he couldn't use the advice even if he could hear it. It's kind of you can't change your premises in mid-Niagara Falls. He'd have no time to do anything with that advice. Whereas in the government case, a whole complex of actions, a whole policy across a long time, they can make use of the advice. And of course, again, in the Blondin case, only physical skills are required. And either you have them or you don't once you're in action, and there's nothing you can do from the outside. On the other hand, suppose that Blondin, I don't have any idea who or what he was, but suppose that he was some kind of occultist, and he got halfway across and he dropped to his knees to start a pray to Allah or something to get him across the rest of the way. You could make a good case there for saying you should stand on the side and say, "Get up, Blondin, and don't pray, climb," you know. In other words, where ideology is involved, even in that case, it would be appropriate, and obviously in connection with the government policy, ideology, values, goals, purposes are involved, and therefore, of course, the whole analogy does not follow. All right, that concludes our last analogy. Now, we still have a question period, and I have a number of interesting questions that I've accumulated, but I simply want to say, for the record, therefore, we have now completed the theory, the entire booklet of exercises, and therefore, I hope you found it of some value. I thank you for your interest and your attendance. Thank you. All right, I have these questions divided into categories, and I'd like to try to take at least most of the accumulated questions from several weeks back before we get to new ones, if there's time for new ones tonight. And first, there's a series of questions on definitions that I will say something about briefly. I'm leaving out all questions that I think are of only specialized interest. So if your question isn't answered and you have submitted it, that's because I judge that it's too technical or specialized for the class as a whole. Why is it that yellow cannot be defined while heat can? I.e., while it is true for both heat and yellow that their effect on the nervous system must be felt, their physical properties can be identified. Well, I don't see any difference between these two cases. They seem to me to be an exact parallel. In both cases, interpreted as the actual sensation, the actual experience, either of yellow or of heat, you must experience it to know what it means. And in that sense, in both cases, the concepts can only be defined ostensibly. On the other hand, in both cases, you can identify the cause involved conceptually in a way that would make it clear even without the ostensive definition. That is, by reference to the type of light waves that produce it or the kind of molecular motion that's involved in regard to heat. So I see no distinction between these two. Both can be defined in the sense that their causes can be identified. As physical phenomena, they can be equally defined. As psychological phenomena, as experiences, they can only be defined ostensibly. So I see no difference on this case. Here is a question on definitions, but it's prefixed with another question, so I throw it in at this point. Is the statement, every is implies an ought, that's a statement from Ms. Rand, an axiom, or can it be proved? Obviously, it is not an axiom. It is certainly a statement which requires proof. You cannot be overgenerous in what you take as an axiom. An axiom is something that can be grasped from direct sense perception. That's the objectivist view. An axiom must be reducible to direct sensory data, like the law of identity, or the law of contradiction, or the fact of existence, or specialized instances of them. But when you get a complex thought like every is implies an ought, that is not something that is inherent in sense data as such. That's a long way down the track. Nothing in ethics can be an axiom or self-evident. Ethics itself is a derivative of metaphysics and epistemology, and therefore there are no axioms in that sense in ethics. There are definitions. There are facts of metaphysics and epistemology which are the precondition, but there are no distinctive axioms. Everything in ethics, including the fundamental value, has to be proved. Now, I won't recapitulate the proof of this point, that every is implies a not, but in essence, it derives from the argument that life is the only proper standard of value, which itself requires a proof starting with an analysis of the concept of value and under what conditions is it necessary and possible. And it's only because life is the standard of value that you conclude every fact is a certain imperative to a living creature and dictates that he must act a certain way in order to sustain his life. And it's in that sense that every is implies an ought. So that is already a derivative of a premise which itself requires proof. Now the question on definition. Did you literally spend 2 hours on the definitions you gave us? He says last time, but several weeks ago. That's the Revolution Propaganda series. Would you normally go through the detailed process you outlined, or was it done for heuristic or pedagogical purposes? Yes, I literally spent about 2 hours apiece on those when I first did them. That was not this time, but some years ago. Now, you mean to imply, do I go through that length of process on every definition? Obviously not. Some concepts are easier than others. Some it's less essential to define. But, and in any case, these processes, as I presented them to you, were somewhat extended, longer than you'd have to do it yourself, in order to chew every particular sub-aspect that might cause trouble. And some of the points were so obvious that you would know them right off and you wouldn't have to think of them. But, so therefore, in that sense, it's a little overdone for pedagogical purposes. But if you ask me as a general point, I would say definitions, particularly of abstract terms, which involve controversial issues, all the central philosophic ones, for instance, that is a complicated process. And particularly when you're first starting, and you don't already have a whole catalog of definitions firm in your mind, you will swim helplessly at first, very often not knowing when you're going to differentiate what concept from what, and you'll have to start from scratch, and it will take several hours. So in that sense, the example I gave, the examples were not unrepresentative. Now that question leads directly into this one. I have a clear definition for very few concepts. Does this mean that most of my concepts float? This is something I've always wanted to know but was afraid to ask. Well, first of all, you must distinguish definitions that stand for obvious, what we call first-level physical objects, qualities, etc., versus higher-level abstractions. Now, I mean by the obvious first-level type of thing, a dog and cat and chair and table, and even more complex ones. It wouldn't be first-level like sandwich and furniture and so on. Now, if you have read Miss Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, you know that she makes the point there that it is least essential or important to define such concepts by means of a formal, verbal, precise definition. Because there they are so closely tied to the obvious physical instances that you give them working ostensive definitions. You can point, oh, I know what a table is, it's that and that, and I know what a rug is, it's that and that, and so on. And those concepts do not float. That's how children hold all concepts. And as adults, that will not harm you so long as you know the method of giving a definition of such concepts if you need it. So the moral to be drawn, that's why I wanted to cover this question, the moral to be drawn from a lectures on definitions is not that you have to sit down with every word you use, because that's a hopeless undertaking if you haven't done it. As long as you have a reasonable ostensive understanding, and you know the method by which you could get an exact one if you needed it, in those cases, that's sufficient and it doesn't float. Where it becomes crucial is with regard to higher level abstractions, not things like sandwich and chairs and tables, but freedom and love and justice and truth, etc. Now, in cases like that, if you do not have a definition, then those definitely do float in your case, because you have nothing to tie them to the concretes in reality which they represent. And here I go back to what was the original purpose of definition, is precisely to keep your concepts anchored in reality by means of identifying the essential characteristics of the concretes they subsume. And so I would say, unfortunately, yes, insofar as you don't have definitions, your concepts do float. Now, I would, however, say that if you are in that position, it is no use trying to formulate a whole dictionary at one sitting. You simply can't do more than you can do. What I would suggest is you take a much more practical method. Don't just take the first word that somebody uses that you can't define and sit and go through that agonizing 2-hour process of trying to figure out its definition, because you won't be able to motivate yourself for long. You use thousands and thousands and thousands of words. I would say wait and do it piecemeal, one point at a time, as and when a given concept comes up and you're using it in some process of reasoning or thinking or investigation, and you can feel an inner unclarity. And at that time, you can sense your own confusion and chaos, and you realize there's something you want to know that requires a definition here. Then you will have the motivation. And if you do one that way, the first one will be excruciatingly hard, because everything will blur into everything else if you haven't been following this method from the time you started acquiring concepts. But you will find that each one that you get firm makes the next one a little bit easier. So once you have revolution or propaganda or whichever, you got something to hang on to as a base. And at a certain point, you find that there's a definite cumulative effect, and pretty soon you are enormously clear about everything. Well, pretty soon. It takes some years, but that's what I would suggest. Now, I have one more on definition, which is you could answer in a long essay or a short comment, and I'm taking the latter. But it is a very interesting question. I'll read the whole question. Do not the meanings of some words change with application? For example, rock and roll, liberal, conservative. How can you maintain a consistent definition with words of this sort? Is it contextual? Is this kind of change proper? Now, this raises a whole host of important and interesting questions, which I will only pick out a few obvious points. First of all, you have to distinguish words actually changing in their meaning across time from words changing with their application. Now, that latter is simply the case that the same word can take on different meanings in different contexts, and in that sense it is contextual. That's essentially the issue of equivocation. Remember the case of trunk that we took. If you use trunk in connection with Grand Central, the elephant's nose, it's a word which changes its meaning in its context because you're obviously applying it to two different situations. So there's no problem with that type of change. The word in each of its usages remains fixed, and your only point is to specify the usage. But the real problem is with the words that actually change their meaning across time. That is, actual shifts in the meaning of words. And this is true from what I can gather of my reading of every known language. And in fact, linguists have defined certain processes which seem to be applicable, at least of the Indo-European languages, seem to be applicable to all languages. There are any number of examples, and they have formulated general rules. There's one process, and I'm not going to start a whole dissertation on this, but there's one process, for instance, called generalization, in which a word which at a certain point was used for one narrow category of things acquired a much more general meaning as people began to use it more and more abstractly. And consequently, you would be simply amazed if you knew what the original meaning of certain words were when you see how they're used today. That, if I remember, I'm not certain of this example, but I think I read this, the word thing, T-H-I-N-G, which is now one of the most general concepts, which stands for any entity, was originally used, I believe, only for Parliament. I think only for the Scandinavian Parliament, if I remember correctly. And that was its original meaning. And across the course of time, it lost that distinct usage and was generalized to refer to any entity of any kind. Now, once that happens, of course, how you're going to define thing today is radically different from when it stood for the Scandinavian Parliament. Or as another example, words can do the opposite. They can specialize in meaning. They can start by having general meaning, applying to a whole group of things. And then people can focus on one outstanding instance, and the word comes to acquire the meaning of that particular instance and not the whole category. Now again, if I remember, this is simply from readings on language that I did years ago, so I'm not certain of the examples, but if I remember correctly, the word deer, for instance, used to be synonymous with animal. And it was true of any animal. And at a certain point, it took on its specialized meaning of a particular type of animal, which it did not have originally. Now, that's the opposite process from the thing case. Then, of course, human beings change their estimates of things as time goes on, depending upon changes in philosophy, social conditions, etc. And words which once had positive connotations end up having very negative ones, and vice versa. Now, I believe, for instance, the Old English or Middle English word for housewife was originally a perfectly reputable word, and I think it's hussif. I don't know how you pronounce it. I never learned the pronunciation of Old English, but the idea is it had perfectly respectable connotations, about like we have housewife today. But it evolved into hussy, which obviously has negative connotations, and this was obviously because of the observations of the way housewives at the time behaved and the conclusions people came to about them. Now, once that change has taken place, obviously housewife, in its hussy version, would acquire a different connotation. And I believe the word boy went in the reverse direction. I think at one time it was insulting. If I remember correctly, boy meant some kind of menial or servant or something pretty negative, and at a certain point it simply came to mean male youngster without any negative connotation. Now, to an extent, because human beings do grasp wider common denominators or focus on particular instances or change their estimates, this type of change is universal in all languages, and this is why we have Old English and Middle English and Modern English. The language itself actually alters in the process of it being spoken as people make new connections and new conclusions. From what I understand, this is unavoidable. It always has happened, and I don't see any way to prevent it from happening. But this is not philosophically disastrous. The question is this kind of change proper, and what should you do? How can you maintain a consistent definition with words of this sort? The answer is, if you see a word in process before your eyes of changing its connotation, like liberal, so that it means one thing to one person, another to another, and another to another, and it has negative connotations in some circles and positive connotations in others, you've got one of two simple ways to maintain a consistent usage of language. Either avoid the term altogether. Simply don't use it, because it's now in flux, and there's more chance of being misunderstood than understood. Or, each time you use it, define your term clearly, define in what sense you use it, and then stick by that usage. And if you do that with that type of word, you can use them safely. Now, if you take the word liberal that the person gives as an example. Now, there's a case where a word changed its meaning for purely philosophic reasons. In the 19th century, the liberals were the advocates on the whole of laissez-faire. And therefore, liberals stood for one who advocated laissez-faire. But they did so essentially on social or utilitarian grounds. On the grounds that laissez-faire would be to the welfare of the country or the group, the collective as a whole. In other words, they were collectivist individualists. And of course, in that clash, their politics necessarily gave way. And at a certain point, their fundamental justification crept into their actual politics. And now you reach the stage where liberal has completely reversed its meaning and means someone who advocates government control in the name of the welfare of the collective. As a result, there is the carryover today of the old usage. I've heard, for instance, objectivism described as classic liberalism. In other words, in effect, 18th century liberalism, which is approximately correct politically if you understood by classical liberalism. But you see, even then I have to give a definition, complete laissez-faire. On the other hand, I've heard Stalin described as a totalitarian liberal. Well, I mean, once you have that range within the same concept, you either throw it out altogether or you specify or using it in such and such a sense. Same is true of conservative, the example given. I've heard objectivists, of course, described as conservative, and I've seen Khrushchev described as a conservative whom the new progressives had to throw out in the name of progress. The only thing that intrigues me about this is rock and roll. How did rock and roll change? You mean like it used to be rock on your heels and roll on your stomach? Or I can't figure that one, but yes. Oh, you mean there's differences within? Oh, well, that, you see, was beyond me. I didn't know that there were differences in the actual types of music designated by rock and roll. I don't follow that genre, so I will reserve any comment. But that is the general category of point I'd make with regard to the changes in language, which is a very interesting subject, but does not have to throw off definitions. I want to ask, can I remember the name of the language book I referred to? Oh, I've got a whole bunch of them. One by Mario Pei, I think, P-E-I. One by Alexander. One by somebody named Laird, I think, L-A-I-R-D. But I just buy books called, The Miracle of Language, Language from the Beginning, or something like that. I always find that an interesting subject. All right, now we get to a few on induction. And this one I want to certainly say at least one word about. Did Newton commit hasty generalizing? Fallacy. When he formulated the laws of motion without studying the motion of bodies near the speed of light? Now, what I want to say about that is a resounding no. He did not. If you interpret the hasty generalizing fallacy as meaning that to avoid it, you have to specify explicitly in your generalization every condition under which it holds before you can state it, then you are saying that you have two choices in life. Either you generalize hastily or you're omniscient. In other words, that you can't generalize validly until you are omniscient, because only when you are omniscient, literally omniscient, know everything about everything in the universe, could you possibly be in a position to say, this generalization holds only under the following conditions A, B, C, D. Now, of course, the objectivist point here, we're verging into epistemology, not logic, is that knowledge is contextual. And that to avoid hasty generalizing, you do not have to know everything, including the unknown, the undreamed of, and the unconceived of at a given state of knowledge. All you have to know is all of the evidence available to a human being in that context of knowledge. Now, at a time when Newton lived and wrote, the issue of the motion of bodies near the speed of light simply could not come up. Could not come up because the context of knowledge would even refer to such things as the speed of light hadn't even been discovered. Therefore, to expect Newton to have taken into account what happens in the event of a phenomenon of whose existence the human race didn't even know is fantastic. Now, should Newton have said, my laws will hold under all conditions, no matter what? They're, in effect, religious dogma. No, he shouldn't. What should he have said? What, in essence, he properly did say. These laws hold under all conditions that are applicable within the present knowledge. If and when we discover anything further, that will not refute these laws. The sheer fact that some variation takes place will be our clue to discover what is the condition in which this law holds, but doesn't in the new case. So the knowledge that we acquire will enable us to expand our knowledge in the next case. On the other hand, if there'd been no Newton, then there could be no Einstein, because he'd have nothing to build on, and you never would have expanded your knowledge. And just to, that's the epistemology on the point. As to the science, Einsteinian theory does not contradict Newtonian physics. It does not. Newton's laws and Einstein's are the same when you're talking about the kind of body motion and speeds at which Newton was concerned. And therefore Newton's, even within the framework of Einsteinian theory, if you don't challenge it, and I think there are points in which its interpretation certainly could be challenged, but that's way outside our province here, it is still the case that Einsteinian theory reduces to Newtonian in those levels and areas of motion that Newton dealt with. In other words, daily motion that doesn't pertain to the speed of light. So it is a complete falsehood to say that Einstein refuted Newton. On the contrary, Newton made Einstein possible. Now, I don't want to get into the physics. I know that you're eager to have me give the objectivist view of relativity theory, which I'm going to scrupulously avoid doing because we just have a few minutes and I have some questions. But if it pertains to logic, yes, okay.
Galileo attempted to measure the speed of light some few years, like 20, 30 years before.
Well, if Galileo attempted, that doesn't pertain to logic. That's simply as you're claiming that I'm ignorant. If it's true that Galileo, no, that's okay. I don't mind. I mean, I don't specialize in being a scientist. My understanding is that they did not even know that light had a speed until the 19th century with the Michelson-Morley experiments. If Galileo had that idea, good for him. But in any event, that would not invalidate the logical point which I made, nor would it invalidate my defense of Newton. Now I have another written question on induction, and it pertains to the lemonade example, which unfortunately I can't remember, but it was either the example, we used it either on difference or on agreement, as a simple example of lemonade causing a stomachache. And this is a question: is the following dichotomy valid? 1. Lemonade is the cause of a stomachache. That is a philosophical explanation. Versus number 2, some factor in the lemonade is the cause of the stomachache, and that is a scientific explanation. Do I agree with this analysis? No. Philosophy is not the same as falsehood. The difference between philosophy and science is not that one states preposterous falsehoods and the other states truth. Anybody who says lemonade unrestrictedly is the cause of stomachaches is a poor thinker. That's neither philosophic nor scientific, or it's bad science. As such, it isn't even philosophy, because it pertains to a particular concrete. The distinction here is that philosophy is concerned with the methods of acquiring knowledge, no matter what the subject matter. In this case, it would be concerned to define the proper principles of induction, difference, agreement, whatever else. Science concerns itself with the concrete application. What is it, the method of difference allow you to conclude in this case, etc. The division of labor is like this. Philosophy tells you the law of cause and effect. Science then tells you this particular thing is the cause of this particular effect. Philosophy tells you everything is what it is. And science tells you, and this particular thing is so-and-so. You see, philosophy gives you the principles applying to everything. Science then implements those principles concretely. So as such, philosophy does not explain stomachaches. Neither via lemonade, something in lemonade, or extra lemonade. It simply is not concerned with stomachaches. It gives the principles applicable to everything. Shoes, ships, stomachaches, the whole works. And then it's up to scientists to apply those principles to particular cases. And now we have a few miscellaneous ones here. How do you answer the charge that the syllogism is superfluous and reveals nothing new, since the conclusion is obviously contained in the premises and all that is necessary is to understand the premises? Would it be that it is only the syllogism that can reveal what is in the premises, that the syllogism is the very tool with which one extracts what is contained in the premises? Well, certainly. This is a typical modern, not contemporary, but modern. This argument has been going strong ever since the Renaissance, since Francis Bacon and then John Stuart Mill and then the whole raft of what are called nominalists today. And the first thing I'd like to point out with regard to this type of attack on the syllogism is that it is a syllogism. So if ever there's an example of the stolen concept of using what you're trying to refute, here's a syllogism. Any form of argument which simply makes the implicit explicit is useless. Second premise, the syllogism is a type of argument which simply makes the implicit explicit. Conclusion, therefore the syllogism is useless. Now that is a perfect syllogism. That is to say, that's Barbara. Now, what is wrong with this reasoning? It's essentially what the person said. The essential value of the syllogism is precisely that it makes the implicit explicit. Or to put it another way, it's not that it's necessary to understand the premises. You can understand the premises without going through the syllogism. you do not understand what those premises lead to when they are connected to each other without the syllogism. What the syllogism does is tell you specifically what follows when you integrate two pieces of information. Now, certainly it follows, but if that's an objection to it, then all reasoning is useless because it comes from premises. But the whole point of reasoning is to tell you what follows when you put together two pieces of information which separately do not give you that conclusion. Now, this is an example I've heard Miss Rand use to make this point. All kinds of people will say that dictatorships are evil. On Monday, let us say. And on Thursday, in a different context, they will say Soviet Russia is a dictatorship. They will not say Soviet Russia is evil. Although that is simply, quote, implicit in the premises and just makes it explicit, but it's precisely that kind of implication which the syllogism is here to draw. To show you what happens when you connect what you know. If you didn't have that, then of course you couldn't function at all. You couldn't even attack the syllogism as was illustrated, as I illustrated. Here's one. Miscellaneous. Some statements, it gives the example, all Martians are redheads, are neither true or false. I'll leave out part of the question, but just the essence. Could you elaborate on the criteria which a statement must achieve to be either true or false? And he's interested in this question because of this square of opposition, but that need not concern us. Yes. In essence, I would say as follows. It's back to the point I made in connection with existential import. A statement about nothing is about nothing and to be dismissed. I'll put it another way. Before a statement can qualify as either true or false, it must have a relationship to reality of some kind. And that relationship has to be guaranteed by the fact that the subject and the predicate of the statement have to be, you could put it this way, have to be valid descriptions. Or to put it another way, they must each refer to an actual or possible fact of reality, both the subject and the predicate, in order to have a statement that is either true or false. Now, for instance, if I say, let us say, some cows give milk. Now that is, I would say, comes in the category of true or false, and it's obviously true, because there is such a phenomenon as cows, and there is such a phenomenon as giving milk. The subject and the predicate are each tied to reality. And in this case, the particular combination that I assert mirrors reality, so it's true. If I say, some cows have one leg, let's say that's false. That still comes within the category of true or false because having one leg is a possible phenomenon and being a cow is a possible phenomenon. But if I so it's a statement which has a connection to reality. Its subject and its predicate are separately connected to an actual or possible reality, even though in this case, when you put the two together into a statement, the combination does not describe a fact. But if I walk around like Bertrand Russell, and I say all golden mountains are golden, true or false, I say that is neither, because there are no golden mountains. And consequently, the subject does not refer to anything actual or possible. Consequently, it's talking about nothing. It is neither true nor false. It's simply Bertrand Russell, which is the appropriate third category. And that's equally applicable to are all Martians redheads? Is the present king of the United States having a bath? And all those questions that these alleged philosophers discuss. Now, yes.
Such statements like the one you just mentioned meaningful or
Are such statements as the ones I just mentioned meaningful or meaningless? There you would have to make a distinction that again goes far beyond the logic course between epistemologically meaningful and metaphysically meaningful. I would say they are metaphysically meaningless. They actually designate nothing, and consequently they're severed from connection with reality altogether. I would say they're meaningful in only one sense. By a feat of Herculean abstraction, I can suppress everything I know about reality. And imagine what must be the mental state of a person uttering such words. And in that sense, the present King of the United States is having a bath is somewhat different from somebody who just says, blah, 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 blah. Now, if you want to say that that difference is that the first, you can grasp what he thinks he's saying, but you have to point out to him he isn't saying anything, and the second he really isn't saying anything. Okay. At the back, yeah. Yeah. What you say earlier, I used the premise you can't do more than you can do. What is the status of that premise? What would you mean by status? How do you prove it? Or? Yeah, now that premise, that does not require an argument because that's simply an illustration of the law of identity. The law of identity says A is A. In this case, the possible is the possible, the impossible is the impossible. And that's all I mean to say when I say you can't do what you can't do. But it's not an empty statement. It doesn't require a separate proof because it's simply an illustration of the law of identity. But it's an important reminder because there are a great many people who, when they hear that, say that's true, but until they think of it, spend a great deal of time trying to do what they know perfectly well they can't do. So this is very valuable sometimes simply to say A is A in that literal form. Did I have another? Yes. Since we only have a few minutes, if you can keep them on logic. Yes.
You can say that all thoughts have one way and the relative to a false statement. Could you also understand that all cows are purple would also be...
When I say all cows are purple is false, yes. Purple is a perfectly valid concept, and so are cows, and that's perfectly straightforward. Yes, sir.
Santa Claus has a white beard.
No, I did not say. Santa Claus has a white beard. Is that meaningless? That depends on what universe you're talking about. Now, let me clarify this. There is discourse about the actual universe, and then there is fictional discourse, in which an author, either of a whole novel or of a mythology or whatever it happens to be, creates an imagined universe. Now, there is such a thing as truth or falsehood with regard to imagined universes. And there the standard is fidelity or not to the universe that the person imagined. So it's true that Santa Claus, for instance, has a white beard. It is not true that he comes down the refrigerator. He comes down the chimney, you see. Now, what do we mean when we say it's true? What do we mean when we say it's true? We don't mean there that it corresponds to actual reality. We mean it corresponds to the invented reality within that framework. It is true. And you can't have true or false about novels, therefore. If you say, at the end of his life, Othello went to Las Vegas, that's false. Within the framework of that particular play. So there's no problem here. Now I'd like to get off this onto another topic for the finale. I don't want to conclude on the note of Bertrand Russell. Does anybody have a question that is of wider interest on definition or induction? Otherwise, I'll conclude on a couple of bibliographical questions which are here. Let me take a last look on what we have. These are requests for whole new topics to be included in the course. Arguments over particular definitions. Here's one. Miss Rand stated, just as the child is father to the man, the nursery school is father to the university. In essence, he's not sure of the quotation. Would I care to explain this analogy? Yes, very simply. The child is father to the man, of course, is a well-known line. And the idea is that what you are as a child is instrumental in determining what you'll be as an adult. Translated into objectivist terms, that would mean the premises that you accept, the attitude you acquire, the values you hold as a child, shape, nurture, influence your direction and growth and determine what you will be ultimately as an adult, with the understanding, of course, that you will have free will and can change. Well, Ms. Rand is simply drawing an analogy. If we understand that the child is father to the man, then the training of the child is father to the training of the man. In other words, the methods that you use in nursery school are going to have enormous effects on determining the nature of the child and the nature of the methods of education that will be usable on him when he grows to the stage of entering a university. So I think the meaning of that is clear, and I think it is certainly a valid analogy. Now I'll take just two quick bibliographical questions, unless someone has, yes.
Do you think that induction will ever be reduced to the precision of deduction? Now,
do I think induction will ever be reduced to the precision that deduction now has? Will induction ever be reduced to the precision? That's a good question. I'd say a fairly unequivocal yes and no. From two different points of view. I believe that the theory of induction can be made, now I'm speaking off the cuff here, I've never actually asked the question that you asked, but just off the cuff. I believe that in principle the theory of induction can be made as precise, as exact, and as formally proved as the theory of deduction. And in that sense, the basic methodology involved in induction can be as clearly defined. But in my present state of knowledge, at least, I think that there's always going to be more difficulty employing induction than deduction, because of the fact that in deduction, your premises already have the information implicit in them, and you are drawing out a conclusion, making explicit what is already contained implicitly. Put it this way, in deduction, you do not have to do further observational work of reality. Once you have your premises, it's a matter, you've made your direct contact with reality, you've stated the information that you've got from reality, and then it's a matter of putting it together, which is a comparatively simple process. Induction is the process where you nakedly face reality, where you ultimately get your premises, you see. And from that point of view, you have a whole uncharted jungle that you have to feel your way through. You don't already have the results of a previous reasoning process encapsulated in formulated way. Now, in this sense, induction involves creativity in a way that deduction doesn't. Anybody who knows the rudiments of logic can take a syllogism where the premises tell you, for instance, about cancer and draw a conclusion. But you may know inductive theory inside and out, and that will not tell you how to find the cause of cancer, and won't even on the day when inductive theory reaches the level of deductive theory, because what will it tell you? Well, I don't have the finally worked out inductive theory, but it'll have to say something like, observe the relevant facts in reality and apply the following procedures. And it cannot, no philosophic procedure can possibly tell you how in every particular case to apply the relevant rule. So, I think there will always be an area in the application of inductive methods where you will have to be steeped in the subject matter and will require a certain kind of creativity if you're pioneering some new unknown area that has no exact counterpart in the deductive area. But in terms of its philosophic precision, I don't see any reason why that can't be formulated as well, and hopefully we will see that done sometime. I mean, in our lifetime. Now, I'll just conclude on this bibliographical note. Two short questions. What are the pitfalls to be aware of when reading Copey's book on logic? That's Irving M. Copey, Introduction to Logic, the most widespread, perhaps, college text. And the main pitfall is Copey. It's wrong from beginning to end, in essence. It's filled with all the modern aberrations, the linguistic view of definitions, the whole issue of existential import, wrong analysis of analogies, wrong analysis of induction. When I've used that book, I use it only for the exercises and advise the students not to read it. The exercises are quite good. And the second is, where, if at all, does Ruby differ with objectivism in his book? I do not recall any substantial disagreement in content, any substantial one. But the trouble with Ruby's book is that it does not present any philosophic base for the positions that he takes, and consequently it, so to speak, is just the common sense approach. So most of it, as I recall, I agree with, but it's presented as in a sort of common sense way, without its deeper validation of the points, and consequently it's limited. But it's certainly, within the framework of what I know, the best extant book. But it's no longer extant because it's out of print. But if you can get it, it'll be of value for a book that has practical exercises. Well, we're past our time, so we'll have to draw a line here. Thank you again for your interest, and good night.